Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Toni Jordan, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Wheeler Centre tonight for this special event. Before we begin, I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this event takes place and their elders past and present. Tonight we are overjoyed to have with us A.M. Holmes. A.M. is the author of 2 collections of short stories, Things You Should Know and The Safety of Objects. She's also the author of the acclaimed memoir The Mistress's Daughter, and 6 novels, amazing, including these 2 fantastic books. The bestseller, This Book Will Save Your Life, or as one of my students call it, the Donut Books. Yeah. And the Women's Prize-winning fantastic work, May We Be Forgiven. Can you join with me in welcoming A.M. Holmes?
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming in.
I'm thrilled to be here. Are you kidding?
We thought that in having a little chat before we started, we thought that just in case there's a very few of you in the audience not familiar with AM's work, she might do just a couple of short readings to give everybody a taste of the book. These will be from May We Be Forgiven?
At the moment it looks like I might be reading from my schedule for tomorrow, so hold on one second.
So May We Be Forgiven is a fantastic story about a man named Harry. Harry is a sort of failing academic and Nixon scholar and historian, and he's always kind of lived in the shadow of his older brother George, and things start to go dramatically wrong for Harry in the very first few pages, and he winds up with a family he never expected in circumstances he never quite expected from his life. So let's see what we have.
I'm going to read to you a little bit from the beginning, and we'll just jump in there. And don't worry, I'm not going to read all of this. And it's already a little bit of an edited version, but here we go. May we be forgiven. An incantation. A prayer, the hope that somehow I come out of this alive. Was there ever a time you thought, I'm doing this on purpose, I'm screwing up, and I don't know why? Do you want my recipe for disaster? The warning sign. Last year, Thanksgiving at their house. 20 or 30 people at tables spreading from the dining room into the living room, stopping abruptly at the piano bench. He was at the head, picking turkey out of his teeth, talking about himself. I kept watching him as I went back and forth carrying plates into the kitchen, the edges of my fingers dipping into unnameable goo, cranberry sauce, sweet potato, cold pearl onion, gristle. With every trip back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room, I hated him more. Every sin of our childhood, beginning with his birth, came back. He entered the world 11 months after me, sickly at first, and was given far too much attention. And then, despite what I repeatedly tried to tell him about how horrible he was, he acted as though he believed he was a gift of the gods. They named him George. Geo he liked to be called, like that was something cool, something scientific, mathematical, analytical. Geode I called him, like a sedimentary rock. By the time we were 10 and 11, he was taller than me, broader, stronger. Are you sure he's not the butcher's boy? My father would ask jokingly, and no one laughed. I was bringing in the plates and platters, casseroles caked with the debris of dinner, and no one noticed that help was needed. Not George, not his 2 children, not his awful friends, not my Chinese-American wife Claire, who hated turkey and never failed to remind us that her family used to celebrate with roast duck and sticky rice. George's wife Jane had been at it all day, cooking, cleaning, and was now scraping slop into a giant trash bin. Jane scoured the plates, piling the dirty dishes one on top of the other. Glancing at me, she brushed her hair away with the back of her hand and smiled. I went back for more. I looked at their children and imagined them dressed as pilgrim in black buckle shoes, doing pilgrim children chores, carrying buckets of milk like human oxen. Nathaniel, 12, and Ashley, 11, sat like lumps at the table, hunched or more like curled as if poured into their chairs, truly spineless, eyes focused on their small screens, the only thing in motion, their thumbs. One texting friends no one had ever seen, the other killing digitized terrorists. I'm a company man, heart and soul, George was saying. I'm the network's president of entertainment. I'm ever aware 24/7. There's a television in every room. The fact is, George can't bear to be alone, not even in the bathroom. The turkey platter was at the center of the table, and I reached over my wife's shoulder and lifted. The tray was heavily and wobbled, and I willed myself to stay strong to carry out the mission while balancing a casserole of Brussels sprouts in the crook of my other arm. The turkey was an heirloom bird, whatever that means. It had been rubbed, relaxed, and herbed into submission, into thinking it wasn't so bad to be decapitated and stuffed up the ass with breadcrumbs and cranberries and an annual rite. The bird had been raised with a goal in mind. I stood in their kitchen, picking at the carcass while Jane did the dishes, bright blue gloves on, up to her elbows in suds. My fingers were deep in the bird, the hollow body still warm, the best bits of stuffing packed in. I dug with my fingers and brought stuffing to my lips. Jane looked at me, my mouth moist, greasy, my fingers curled into what would have been the turkey's G-spot if they had such things. She lifted her hands out of the water and came towards me to plant one on me, not friendly. The kiss was serious and full of desire. It was terrifying and unexpected. She did it, then snapped off her gloves and walked out of the room. I was holding the counter, gripping it with greasy fingers. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you. It's quite amazing to read something that's so, in one sense, it's so grim and dark, but the other sense, it's so witty and funny. Was it fun to write? Do you like the experience of writing?
It was fun to write, actually. Yeah, there's a lot of things in this book that I honestly, publishing was at such a bad time when I started writing this book that I sort of thought, all bets are off and just write the book that you want to write. And I think that was a really good decision because I let myself also kind of take excursions within the book that I might not otherwise have done. And I just thought, just go for it.
So you can just put in anything you want. So I'm going to make Don DeLillo look like a homeless person outside the hardware store, pop that in. Pop in Richard Nixon's sideline career as a fiction writer and some of his short stories in there, just anything.
Yeah, all those good things. And also, Don DeLillo, who I love and I'm a huge fan of, and I admire, and something I was playing with in this book was the combining or the blend of history and fact and fiction. And I think DeLillo explores it really well. But also, importantly, Don DeLillo in reality lives right where this book is set. So he knows exactly what hardware store I'm talking about and what Starbucks. It's not implausible for him to walk through this book.
We do see a little bit of George, and he's strong in the beginning, George, the brother of Harry, and then he has a very bad end. I don't think it's giving too much away if I say that he ends up in a mental institution. No spoilers so far, and has a sort of a life that's a variety of like survivor asylums, kind of. Yeah. So things go badly wrong for him. But he's a TV executive. He had some great TV shows on the go, including a reality show called Your Life Sucks, and a cooking show called Refrigerator Wars.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So, there's a very satirical edge to that. But you've also had experience in TV, writing TV.
Your Life Sucks. No. I have, and I've for many years now, or several years, written television pilots, and I have what's called a blind deal with CBS TV. And I always thought that, because I know nothing really about how TV works, a blind deal means you just poke out your own eyes and start typing.
Right.
And that's pretty much what happens. And then you work really hard on the show, and they say, we love it, we love it, we love it. And then you get this call, and they go, we killed it. But you get health insurance, actually, which in America, as you know, is a big deal.
We've been hearing a lot about that.
Yes, exactly.
So there's writing for TV.
Yeah.
There's the novels. This novel actually started in quite an unusual fashion.
It did. Zadie Smith made me write it.
Zadie Smith. Wouldn't you like to say that? You could just put that on the front.
Zadie Smith made me write this book. Exactly.
How did that
to keep me off the streets? She was working on this very nice anthology for a charitable Dave Eggers project. And she said, will you write a short story that's kind of character-based? And I thought, I'd been thinking about brothers and angry brothers, and I thought, use the angry brothers. That's a good way into a short story. And then, unfortunately, it took 7 years to finish.
So, novels, 6 novels, two short story collections, writing for television.
Yeah.
Your very acclaimed memoir.
Yeah. Travel book.
Wow.
Los Angeles.
Wow, the travel book, I forgot that.
I just haven't written a greeting card yet, and I'm really hoping to get to that.
Because this book is, just as this book is a kind of New York book, an East Coast book, this one is a West Coast book, almost exactly, almost a parallel opposite. How do you decide if something is going to be a short story or it's going to be a TV show or it's going to be a novel? How does that happen?
The good news is I don't have to, because literally, except for the problem with the short stories that turn into novels, the terms of each item, for lack of a better word, are so different. So the material that would work as a short story is usually very different than what really works as a novel. And it's the kind of thing that wouldn't necessarily sustain itself over several hundred pages. And sometimes that has to do with the way it's being told, the scope of the story. Other times, different sort of things help define it in some ways. I tend to, though, I've noticed, as my novels have gotten longer, the short stories have also gotten longer, which is sort of worrying me now. Because I'm like, is this, the collected short novels of, or whatever. So I am looking forward to that greeting card phase. I'm going to have greeting cards that just say things like this: "It's your birthday."
So this is A.M. Holmes' minimalist.
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly. Yeah.
Because the things that happen in this book, it's just event after event for poor Harry. So there's adultery, divorce, his brother in the asylum.
That's the first part. That's the 20 pages.
Yeah, the first 20 pages, that all happens. Murder in grotesque fashion.
Horrible.
Pedophilia.
Is there pedophilia in this book?
Well,
I thought that was another book.
No, Ashley and her.
Right, the teacher. Right, exactly.
Yeah, right.
I forgot.
I hadn't forgotten the other book that has the pedophilia.
Right, exactly.
But if I had to actually pick out something that these two books had in common, I thought maybe it was this idea that some of us go through life almost asleep.
Yes, well, that's definitely. I mean, I think there's two big themes: the sleeping human and family. And I think I'm always writing about that. And I think I'm afraid of people who go through life asleep or not. I don't say not conscious, but not attending to what's going on in their families, in their lives, and in an interesting way, not attending to what's going on within themselves, most importantly. I mean, I would describe Harry as sort of, it's a midlife coming-of-age story, which is a very odd thing. But he's a guy who's always sort of waited for his life to begin as though someone else has to start it for you. And I think at a certain point after his brothers killed, his wife, and he's screwed all these people and all this, he's like, oh my God, I'm in charge of my own life. And then the question becomes, what kind of person do you want to be? And the interesting struggle was, will Harry rise to the occasion and become a person I can be proud of, or will he just go downhill? And it was a big struggle. He wanted to go downhill. And I said, Harry, I can't go there with you. You've got to stay with me, Harry. We're going to get through this. There's hope.
So do you think these, I mean, to me, these are more hopeful books than some of your earlier work?
They are, but I think that, I was talking about this earlier today, I think the oddest thing is that it's harder to be hopeful. It's so easy to just be depressive. The world is going to hell. I know. It's really hard to actually turn a corner and think the world is going to hell, but that's okay. No, I'm just kidding. No, but to think, like, how do you, I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but how do you think optimistically or write optimistically when you're living in a time that's not inherently optimistic? I look at, whether it's the wars that we're in as a world, the environment, all the different things that are out there that seem very difficult and in many ways larger than each of us as an individual. And then I think about, well, how do you kind of pull it together and deal with that in some way?
But your work would not be the same without the humour. It's almost like that gives you a license to...
Well, the humor's there. I think the funny thing is I'm glad everyone else likes it. It's there to get me through the whole process. I mean, I think there's, it's going to sound like a non sequitur, but Angela Carter wrote this really interesting book a long time ago about the social uses of pornography and the way pornography functions in a society. And I think humor also has a function in a society and in allowing us to talk about things that are very painful and very difficult to talk about otherwise. But if we can laugh about it along the way, it actually allows us to go a little bit deeper in both in tolerating how painful it is, but also in exploring that. And I think that's something that I've been trying to do more of in the last couple of books.
Your earlier work was quite controversial in a lot of ways. There was... The End of Alice was very... Can you talk a bit about the response that book sort of generated?
Banned. I think it was banned.
Let's just cut to the chase. It was banned.
It was banned. It was interesting. So it's a novel about a jailed pedophile murderer, which, okay, I get it. And it's a very difficult book. It's not a book like when people come up to go, I love The End of Alice, I'm frightened, okay? That's not the response I want to hear. Or they'd say, we have things in common. And I think, no, not really, not so much. And including people like have written to me from jail, and then I get this note, and it'll say, I wrote to you and it was sent back to me, but then your publisher was kind enough to give me your home address. I'm like, that's great. I can't wait to see you next Thursday outside my house. But all that said, it is a book that really I wrote in part to sort of talk about how we as a society don't deal very well with the notion of sexual abuse and sexual predators. And what's part of so scary about this book is it's told from the point of view of the predator. And he literally says, if I'm in jail, then why is this still happening? Which sort of throws it back on us. It's a very, very challenging book. And it came out in the U.S. and it was in an election year, and I really thought this is going to be difficult. And then somehow it wasn't. And then it came out in England, and the day it came out in England, I got this phone call. I had gone over to do a publicity tour, and they go, they said, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children has called for the withdrawal of this book. And in the U.S. we have the Royal Society, not the Royal, but this is ASPCA, which is cruelty to animals. I was like, oh, I really didn't think that much about it. And then the next day, it was like one of those joke newspapers you get on your birthday where there's your picture on the front page and it says something like, happy birthday. But it basically said, like, pedophile arrives in the UK with, like, my photo. I was like, and it turned into this huge thing, huge. And I had to go on the BBC and what's the Prime Minister's spot and explain myself to the country. And then I was invited back at one point to do a free speech conference, and the publisher said, not that your life would necessarily be in danger, but. And I thought, I'm so busy that day anyway. So it was very, very difficult, and it in France, it took 17 years before the book came out.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Did that change your view of writing or what you were trying to do? No,
because the interesting thing, and we were talking about this a little bit backstage, was the novel I'd written before that is a novel called Country of Mothers, and I really am a fiction writer, but there was a thread of Country of Mothers in that it was about a person who'd been adopted, and I am adopted, and it was a novel that I really felt I didn't do a good job writing, and everyone else seemed to like it, the reviewers liked it, readers liked it, but I felt I had cheated the material in some way. So when I went on to write The End of Alice, I really said to myself, whatever comes up in this book, you cannot run away. And I really held myself to it in very extreme sort of circumstances. And I think that the idea was to prompt a conversation that's a very, very difficult conversation. And, one of the threads about how I ended up writing that book was I was sitting in a cafe and I heard two people talking about Lolita. And one of them goes like, I don't think he really slept with her. And the other one's like, I think maybe he did. And he's like, no, I don't think so. And I thought, how can you read that book and just decide that didn't happen? And then I was thinking about this weird progression of, so Lolita came out in 1961, which is a while ago. And I was thinking about the progression of music from 1961. So we had songs like, Wake Up Little Susie, and then the progression to like 9 Inch Nails and Metallica. And I thought, what is the literary progression? And what would, not that End of Alice is in any way, just don't be mistaken that it's not like Lolita or as good as Lolita, but what is the literary progression of the expression of extreme emotion and things? And I basically wanted to write a book where you could not say, I don't think he slept with her. Because that's a denial of the whole thing. So I just thought, I'm just going to have that pedophile talk to the woman.
But that writing process must mean attempting to put yourself in the psychic shoes of a person like that. Like, there's an immersion required.
Right. Okay, so that was difficult.
Yeah. And both these characters, these middle-aged men, I actually asked the novelist M.J. Hyland, the British novelist, this because she predominantly writes from the point of view of men. And she told me once she felt it was easier because it's easier to maintain that distance.
Well, I think the truth is, I am a woman. I know what it's like to be a middle-aged woman. It's, so I'd rather, if I'm going to do something and I'm going to entertain myself, I want to be someone very different. I'm happy also to write from the point of view of a nun. I would love to try that. I'm really curious what that's all about. So anyone who's different from me, but I secretly love middle-aged men. And so I just do. And it's nice to be among them and to sort of, and I also am always asking like guys, well, no, what do you really think about her? What do you don't say to the rest of us? And so it's fun.
Writing the memoir must have been a very different experience from that.
Very different from the middle-aged man, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
But being you, I suppose being even more you than you. You've spoken a bit about the idea of being adopted and how that's almost rightly in the feeling that you're observing.
Right, absolutely. When you're adopted, you are always observing and you're always at a distance. So that's... And I think that's interesting because I've talked to people like Edward Albee. There's a whole little group of us, the literary adoptees.
That's like a club. The little
it is. It's so depressing, though. But we're all up for adoption again. So if you know anyone who wants... Edward's, I think he's almost 90 now, so he definitely needs a good family. Good with a senior. And I have I've come with a child and some pets and things if anyone wants to adopt me. But I think there's that sense that probably is very useful to a writer of being an outsider always, and that you are an outsider in your own life. And I realized when my daughter was writing a play about Abraham Lincoln, that it's sort of the equivalent of being born as George Washington but told that you're Abe Lincoln. Like you are born as somebody else, even if no one gives you the information, because we're hardwired. So you have...
So you think that there's a biological determinism?
Well, I think there's you're born with a personality. You're born with traits that are not unlike, in some degrees, your mother and father. I mean, now that I have this biological child, I can see how that works. But instead, you go to someone else's house and they go, "You're Abe Lincoln," and George Washington's like, "Really? God, I just feel like freeing slaves right now. I don't know what's, there is a dissonance that I think people who aren't adopted don't know about. And I think people who are adopted think, what's this dissonance? I don't know. Does everybody have this? So it's interesting.
Do people think they know you after having read the memoir, or do they not believe
people always
the memoir?
think they know you, don't you think that?
But do people think they know you from the fiction or from the memoir, or do they not believe
all of
the
it?
memoir?
I think and they also I think there's a funny thing, honestly, where a lot of times people don't realize that fiction is fiction, that you make it up. So they go, "I read your novel. It's all true, right?" I'm like, no. I think when they read the memoir, the interesting thing is they get to know a piece of me, and the adoption is a piece of me. It's not by any means all of me. I'm so much worse and more complicated than you could possibly imagine. So it is a piece, and I think importantly, when I was writing it, and I really struggled. I'm not by nature a nonfiction writer. I don't like writing about myself, or particularly even talking about myself. But I felt that having already written a number of books, that I could bring whatever skills I had as a writer to finding language for an emotional experience that was hard to find language for, and then it might have meaning for other people. And that turned out to be very true. And I think one of my friends who had not written anything before said, "You're going to hate going out on book tour for a memoir because all people do is come up to you and confess, and they tell you their story." And the truth is, I think that's wonderful. And I've been in places where people who are in their 80s will come up and say things like, "My wife wanted to come tonight, but she couldn't, but she very much wants to find her family," which, as you know, as somebody in their 80s, it's hard to find their family. So it's heartbreaking and really, really touching. So,
Would you always have been a writer? Is there any other thing you would have become?
I wanted to be in the Rolling Stones. Such a bummer. No girls, number one, okay? And very low vacancy rate. So...
But have you written since?
I say, have you practiced?
Yeah.
I've been practicing.
What instruments do you play? No, have you written since you were a younger?
I dropped out of 10th grade to write this book of poems called An Introduction to Death with Excerpts from Life. It's all about being a teenager.
Is that published? No?
No, it's not published, funny enough. I would write a poem that was so I wish I was dead. I really wish I was dead. I super, super wish I was dead. And I would bring it out and go, "Mom, here, could you type this?" And she would call the therapist. She wishes she was dead. She really wishes she was dead. And the therapist would go, "Oh, that's progress." It's just terrible. Terrible, terrible.
Art is important to you. Perhaps you would have been an artist.
I can't say I was an artist. I went to art school. I painted. I was a photographer. I used to have a dark room in the downstairs basement of my parents' house, and then I would develop pictures and wipe my hands on my pants after being in chemicals and just go eat lunch. I had no idea that you should actually wash your hands after that. I love art, and my father was a painter, and I grew up in Washington, D.C., so he was also very political, and he had all these rules, like you couldn't eat lettuce if it wasn't picked by union workers, and you couldn't eat this because it wasn't good for you. But somehow in the museum cafeteria, you could eat anything. So I would sit there looking at art all day, basically to get cake and Jell-O, two of my favorite foods.
And so that created a positive response, and that's what made you love it.
Well, I know a lot about art suddenly, and I still like cake and Jell-O. And the weird thing is, quite literally, everywhere in the world that I go, to me, an art museum is a lot like a library. And it is a place it's almost kind of also church-like. And it's so, in every city, in every country, I orient myself by the museums and the libraries and the art galleries. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There is something kind of artistic about the books in the way that it's a very quick setting, more photographic, I suppose, very quick setting, then we move on. Mm-hmm. And the dialogue is this kind of rapid-fire things. Yeah. And the pacing is quite extraordinary. Yeah. It's exhausting. Sometimes you have to put it down and give it a break.
Well, it's meant to tire you out, to get a good night's sleep. This particular book, the funny thing is, I kept thinking, why is this taking so long to write as the years were ticking by and my hair was going gray? And I didn't realize really even how long it was getting. And then I finished it and I turned it into the editor, and he called me back and he goes, chapters? And I realized there weren't even space breaks in it. It was just all one paragraph, basically. And I said, I'll let you have like little space breaks in case people have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
But
See, I've told my students that's deliberate. I've said A.M. Holmes thinks so much about pace that there are no chapter breaks because she wants to generate this feel of a boulder rolling down a hill. So don't disprove me.
No, I think that's partially true. And also the interesting thing, I think this is the first time I've accomplished it, is this is a novel that is written with the compression of a short story. Mm-hmm. So it is essentially a short story in novel form. And usually novels are more elongated and have more sort of natural pauses. And often they do have these things called chapters, which are very different because a chapter has a shape. And I looked at this and I thought, I can't go back. You can't go back and build chapters where there are none. So it really is a short story that happens to be a couple 100,000 words long.
You also teach writing. How does that work with creating?
Oh, with me writing?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't. How does it work for you?
Yeah, terribly.
Yeah, just eats right into that. I like teaching. I feel like I've been lucky and had teachers that teach the larger subject, which is actually life. And that's the harder one to teach. And so I feel like my greatest success as a teacher was not the student who became published or whatever. It was the one who became a rabbi. I thought, oh my God, I made a rabbi. That's a high level.
Did you study writing yourself?
I thought you said, did you study like rabbinical? I studied writing. I wrote a play when I was 19. That was the first thing I wrote. This play that was
This is after
produced.
the collection of death poems.
This is after my death poems. And I wrote this play, and in that really weird way, when you're 19, you write a play, and you just send it out all across the country because you think you've written a play. You should tell everyone. And then weirdly, it won this playwriting prize in Washington, D.C., where I lived. And I went down to meet the people at the theater, and I walked in, and I'm sitting there for a while, and they go, like, can we help you? And I said, I'm A.M. Holmes. And they're like, basically, this is all my life. They go, no, you're not. Because in their mind, A.M. Holmes was some man who was in his mid-40s who'd written this play, who lived in Washington, D.C. And I looked about 9. I think my father actually had to drive me because it was in a bad neighborhood, where theaters often are, as you know.
Maybe tell the story a little bit about that play, because that kind of was the first idea of reality impinging on your art.
Yeah. Okay, so the play, I wrote it literally I was 19, and it's a story about a radio call-in show, and this was before there were that many of them. And it was in part prompted by, do you remember the guy who shot John Lennon took out Catcher in the Rye and started reading it? And I found that very upsetting because I loved Catcher in the Rye, and I was a huge Challenger fan. And the idea that somebody would somehow use the book, I don't know, is part of essentially a murder, just upset me. So I wrote this play in which Holden Caulfield is a real person, and he goes on a talk radio station to tell people to stop hanging on to this book, to get on with their lives and move it along. And the last caller is J.D. Salinger, who calls in and kind of confronts him about this. And I thought I was so clever, and I did all this research and used all real radio stations around the country and so on. And then one of them, I had a radio station in Baltimore, and a girl calls in threatening to jump off the tower in the radio station. And like 3 weeks after I finished the book, sure enough, some girl threatens to jump off this, or the play, a girl threatens to jump off the tower. And it sounds odd to say, but almost everything I've written has had that element of prescience to it. Mm-hmm. The novel I wrote, Music for Torching, ends with a shooting in a school, and it came out 3 weeks before Columbine. And then the Donut book has this mudslide in California, which happened after I finished it. And not that I'm not like a,
Psychic.
don't ask me
writer.
about don't ask me about it. How long will your mother-in-law live? But I think it's about, to me, it signals to me in some way that I've gotten it right in the sense that I'm reading the culture.
Yeah.
So
But
that's
they're only half realism, the books. They're sort of half realism and half surrealism.
Absolutely. That's realism. That's real life now.
Yeah.
They've changed it. It's only half real. Because, come on, when you walk down the street, do you think it's real? I'm not sure half the time.
But that also comes back to sometimes when you talk about the effect of technology on us.
Well, exactly.
How we're not quite present.
Right.
There's a great passage here. I won't flick through and find it, but it's something about you were friends with people that are not your friends or something like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Or that you meet people through looking at their genitals online. Hi, nice to meet you. Why? Do we have to? I mean, it's just like horrible.
This book really came to prominence here
Yeah.
when it won the Women's Prize for Fiction 2 years ago in the UK. We have our own Women's Prize for Fiction
I
in
heard.
Stella. It's
Yeah.
quite new for us.
2 years.
Yeah. What do you feel about these women's prizes?
Well, philosophically, I feel like there should not be prizes given based on gender. That said, it appears that all the other prizes are the men's prizes, so why not?
Thank you. So we've got to go somewhere with that.
I don't know.
We've got
It's
to
just,
do something with
yeah.
that. Is it very conscious? I mean, your feminism is kind of underplayed in these books because there's a humanity to all of it, to all the people. How do you feel that relates to the work that you're doing?
Feminism?
Yeah.
I think the greatest example of feminism was Grace Paley, who was a teacher of mine, who was a short story writer. And Grace was absolutely a feminist, and she absolutely loved men. And I feel very much the same way. I think that the idea of feminism basically is that somehow we have to separate ourselves from men and be against men to be feminists. And the truth is, I adore men. I think sometimes they don't realize that there's anyone else around, but that's just the way it goes. So I guess, and I've always avoided in a way this, and we've had a lot of conversation about this in the U.S., about the reviewing of women's books. There are very much fewer books by women are reviewed in the United States than books by men. And the truth is, do I think that that's fair? Do I think it's good? No, I really don't. But I feel like the way to be most successful is to just be in the room with men and remind men that there are other people. Also, a lot of the men I know don't realize there's also, not only they're not women, there's also nobody who's not white. They're only white men. And I've been on lots of, I sit on Penn boards and all these boards, and they'll say, let's give a prize. And every year it's like, let's give the prize to it's a Jonathan, it's all these, they're mostly Jonathans. There's mostly just white men named Jonathan. And I think that other people of all varieties should be getting prizes too, and they shouldn't have to have special prizes called the prize for other people of other varieties.
Other than Jonathan's.
Yeah.
Other than Jonathan.
Or we should just have a prize that is called the Jonathan Prize, and maybe give it to the other people, and just say, we can all be Jonathans now.
So who do you like to read? Who are your...
Jonathans.
Yeah.
I love a good Jonathan. What's Jonathan Cheever, okay? Maybe John Cheever. No, who do I like to read? I read a lot of weirdly nonfiction and science and strange things about black holes and time warps. And if I'm trying to write fiction, I don't read a lot of fiction that's contemporary. I love a guy named Richard Yates, who's a very depressing, almost a Jonathan, but more depressing.
And it's set in... Richard Yates' books are about the same
they're all in the
geography.
same neighborhood. Yeah. Which is this weird suburb outside of New York City called Westchester County, where I went to college, but I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is a very odd place to grow up. I'm trying to think who else I read. I'll read anything. I mean, I read like cereal boxes for hours. I'm like, oh, it's so interesting. Niacin. What is that? I'm by nature very curious, so almost anything I can just read for hours.
And I also have to ask you about politics just a little bit, because we have a very sensitive Richard Nixon in this book who writes very lovely short stories that shows his faith for the common man. And there's also a great quote in here where you say there are really two types of American presidents, those that screw around really and those that invade countries, and they're one or the other.
Right.
I know that
you said that in a very polite way. I said it in a much cruder way in the book, yeah.
Is that, how do you
I think
feel?
it probably is true. I mean,
Yeah?
I think if we did a study of the American presidents who received sexual favors at the office or near the office by many people, and the number of wars they started, it's probably fewer.
It's an inverse
I think there's some
scale.
relationship to sex and war that just isn't owned up to enough.
There's quite a bit of sex in this book, actually.
Well, there you go. There's very little war in it, however.
It took us a little bit. It took us a few minutes to get round to the sex bits.
Yeah.
But Harry goes on quite a binge, an internet dating
Well,
kind of binge.
I didn't make that up. I did all this research, and it is shocking what is out there. I mean, the funny thing is, you would think that I'm hard to shock. I was like, oh my God. The specificity of what people are asking for just astounded me. Yeah, and then the weird thing is I would look up, like these, we have this thing called Craigslist, and it has a section called, I think it's Missed Connections, or I don't even know what it is, but I was also looking it up in different American cities, and San Francisco is very unique. I don't want to bore you with the details, but
we wouldn't be bored, I don't think.
no, but I was really, really surprised.
But there's also a gorgeous bit where Harry goes on this date, like a lunch. He takes to dating these women that he meets who just say, how big are you and, when will you be over?
Right, exactly.
And finds that in one case, there's actually no woman in the house. It's two children who are left by themselves and are just furious at their parents, and they handcuff him as a demonstration of their fury. And these children are actually chipped, aren't they?
Yeah, they have chips so you can find them.
So that, their parents know they're home on time,
right.
and they're monitored in this fashion.
Yeah.
And there's another gorgeous line, which I'm going to mangle, but it's something like, Dad works all the time and Mum only exists electronically or something.
Like that, yeah.
So, things don't always go right.
No, not at all. No, and that little scene is sort of based on, we have this TV show called Predator, where they're always setting up, like, sort of rather pathetic, my favorite middle-aged men, to, like, hit on some teenager, and then the police are there. And I like this idea that he's going to their house to meet their mom for what's supposedly like a sex date, and these two children are there, and they bust him and they kidnap him, but they don't even really know what a sex date is. And then he kind of has to talk to them about their lives, and maybe they should be adopted, and so on and so forth. And then he escapes.
And that's kind of one of a rotating list of children in powerless kind of situations. There's a lot of empathy for children in this book, as there is in all your work.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is, it's funny. People goes, she's the most transgressive writer, and I think, really? Because going back to Jack, which was my first novel, it's about a 14-year-old boy, and the children in this, I feel like what's interesting is that often in literature, children and old people are not developed as whole characters, they're props. And I think in this book especially, both the children and the older people are fully developed people and have lives and needs and perspectives that are unique to their years. And that always interests me a lot.
Maybe if we speak a bit about your first book about Jack, because that's still
Sure.
on some school curriculums.
I wrote it as homework.
Did you really?
Yes, absolutely. You're supposed to write a paper, and I said, could I write a novel instead of a paper? And the teacher said, what makes you think you can write a novel? And I thought, I know I can't write a paper, let's just be honest. And then she said, it's very funny, because it was all part of being 19 in that same area time-wise. And she said, this book will be very controversial. And I thought, because it was a story about a kid whose dad was gay, and that was totally not talked about then. And I went actually, because I lived in Washington, to the Library of Congress, which is our national library that has one copy of every book published. And I said, I like the books about kids whose parents are gay, and there was one book that was published in Canada. Like Daddy Has a Roommate. Seriously. And then the interesting thing is, so Jack is this very sweet story about this boy finding out that his parents are divorced because his father is gay and being very upset about it. And I really wanted to write about bias in the larger sense, and what does it mean to realize that you feel biased about something. And then interestingly, the book is on the one hand on all these school reading lists, and on the other hand, it's one of the 100 most banned books in the country. Not, and The End of Alice is not, actually, which is a problem. I mean, I would reverse that if I were them.
What kind of response do you get for readers from your books, all through the books? Do you get emails and letters and things?
Well, it really changes. I mean, I think I get, and it's also changed now, actually, because it's so awful, but post 9/11 in the U.S., when there were all these weird white powders being mailed, publishers stopped accepting a lot of author mail. So you used to get author mail that would come to the publisher, and then they would forward it to you, and all of a sudden they just don't anymore. So with Jack, which was the first book, I would get stories or letters that kids would write me saying either things like, I'm gay and I can't tell anybody, I can't even give you my name, heartbreaking stories, or this is something in my family, or they would say, I'm doing homework and I need to know the following things. And they would actually ask me to write the paper for them, which I always thought was kind of great. And then with the end of Alice, I'd get, prisoners, and I'd do these readings, and a lot of weird people would show up. And I remember, again, there was one time where I was in the middle of America, and they said, we've had a threat at your reading. Someone's going to disrupt it. And I'm like, did you call anyone or do anything? And the whole time I'm reading, I'm looking at everybody thinking, are you the threat? Are you the threat? So it's complicated. And then what I like about it, I guess, actually, is it really is a range. I mean, there's a complete range. In the memoirs, a very different audience. It's nice.
What is a great American novel? What does that mean?
It just means a big American novel. I looked it up because everyone's like, are you writing the great American novel? I thought, I don't know.
Because this has been described as
and the other thing that this will sound funny, but it's not. Only Jonathans are allowed to write the great American novel. It turns out that actually women, and this is so serious, are not expected. The great American novel is meant to have political, social, and sort of large themes. And it turns out I did not get the memo. Women are supposed to write small domestic stories involving ironing. And I'm not good at ironing. I try.
And you're very popular at home in America? Well, they love this kind of thing? Or you just...
I'm okay.
Sometimes I get a feeling that some novelists need a little bit of distance to have that work fully appreciated. Do you think...
Oh, from the distance? Yeah. I think what's interesting is that I like the fact I've always really loved that my books are translated into other languages, and the idea that the Donut book comes out in Korean, and the best part of that was they wanted to put a coupon from Dunkin' Donuts in the book, and my agent said, absolutely not, we would never do that, we can't do that. And I said, absolutely yes, we're going to put the coupon in the book. Because the idea that somehow you would buy this book and then go into a Korean Dunkin' Donuts with the book and get, 25 cents off your donut, I'm all for it. And I actually also like that it's called the Donut Book,
It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions for A.M. Holmes? What would you like to ask her? There's a bit of thinking. I should provide some thinking music.
If you don't have questions, I have questions for you.
We have a question. Hold.
Hello. I've noticed that the catalyst for all the events in your book seems to be something of a disintegration of what you might call the American dream. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
The American dream. I'm very interested in the American dream, obviously. I think of it as a post-World War II concept, that coming out of the war there was a sense of sort of prosperity and promise and hope. And also the economics shifted a lot. So before the war, we were economically in a different place. And I think people came out, there was the GI Bill for education. The idea being of the dream that if you worked hard, you would have a home, a wife, children, a car, and a house, and a bunch of other little things. And then all of a sudden it started turning into a weird thing where it became no longer a dream, but a sense of entitlement. And it was no longer an aspiration, but somehow this was owed to you. And then we had the subprime mortgage crisis, where all of a sudden it turned out it wasn't really owed to you and you owed someone a lot of money. But in all seriousness, I think that what we lost track of was the notion of a dream. And I think that we see that when you look at, going back to politics, American politics, Kennedy ran on a dream. Martin Luther King had a dream. Barack Obama actually had a hope and a dream. And George Bush offered you $300 back. And he did. It was an actual tax rebate. And the weird thing is no one calculated how much that $300 cost you when your entire retirement plan, went awry. So I'm interested in the dream as both the hope and the fantasy. And I think what interests me, and you'll see this in the last couple of books, is that there's the people who are immigrating into the United States or are newer to the United States have more of a sense of that dream and that hope. And I think you see my characters who are sort of, old timers are kind of more jaded and struggling with what does that mean.
Thank you. Hello, sir.
I was just wondering if you could give us the origin of your very famous short story about Barbie, which is quite macabre,
sure.
quite bizarre, and quite terrifying to read, I must say.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Right. So the question is about a short story I wrote called A Real Doll, which was a story about a boy dating a Barbie doll. And the origin of it actually goes back to my childhood. So my family, where you couldn't have the iceberg lettuce because it wasn't Union, and you couldn't have this because it wasn't right. You also couldn't have Barbie because Barbie was not a good toy for little girls. Her shape is all wrong for children. So you could have crayons and white paper. So at a certain point, I'm like, I'm going on this, what they now call a play date, which was just otherwise known as I'm going over to someone's house. And I said, basically, Mom, I can't go if you don't get me a Barbie. Okay, it's enough already. Susie Korn has a lot of Barbies, and I'm going to need to bring a Barbie over there, and the crayons are not going to cut it. So she bought me like one lone Barbie. I'm like, here, it's my Barbie. So skipping forward then about 20-some years, I was at graduate school at the University of Iowa, and I had this idea of writing just a very whimsical, lighthearted story about a boy dating a Barbie doll. And I went to the local toy store in Iowa, and I said, I need a Barbie, because I had to do some research. And they said, we only have my first Barbie. And my first Barbie is basically Virgin Barbie. She wears a white dress, and the box says, now with larger buttons, which means it's easier to undress her. And it turned out that somehow undressing Barbie is all that people want to do. So I bought this Barbie, and I put it on the mantle. And, various other graduate students, male and female, came in, and all they did was like play therapies. They undressed my Barbie and told me horrible stories of things they or their brothers and sisters had done to her. So my seemingly innocent story about just a boy dating Barbie turned to this dark psychological thing about, who is Barbie and what does she really mean to us? And then, interestingly, all these magazines wanted to publish the story, but Mattel was incredibly litigious about Barbie, and it became an interesting, like the play with J.D. Salinger in it, copyright law. Is Barbie a public figure? And is she entitled to her own identity? And the case they cited, and again, only in my life would this happen, is the pornographic movie Debbie Does Dallas versus the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. And I was just like, too much. And now, interestingly, there's been this whole body of work about Barbies because all of the writers and artists who are about my age grew up with Barbie, and so she became, in fact, a public figure, and Mattel has not been able to sue any of us.
And you had such good intentions at the beginning.
I did. It was so sweet. A boy dating Barbie. They put pins in her head. People go like, oh, yeah, we put pins in her head. Those are earrings. And then there was people would tell me like their sisters melted her feet or chewed her feet, which is all in the story. It's just
I
difficult.
cut off the hair of mine and then sobbed and sobbed when I realized
exactly.
it wouldn't grow back.
Exactly. Well, you didn't have the one with the hair where you put there was a button.
I had a different one.
Because there was one that
bigger.
has a button in the belly button. If you push it, you can pull out more hair. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions, or shall we just continue chatting about childhood toys? Oh, we do have another one.
I must confess, I'm going to ask a question because there were two males who asked the questions, and I find this always happens in these sorts of events. But I was fascinated when you said that your books are being translated, and I'm curious as to in which countries you actually get the highest number of sales, because in reading your books, I mean, there is something very distinctively, I think, American about them, which I absolutely delight in. But I'm just curious about the responses you get in other countries and other cultures.
I think that's a very good question. I would say I honestly don't know the answer. I think that the books are, and I always describe this, I sort of say, for better or worse, I'm a very American writer, and which is a complicated thing in many ways, because I think that the American point of view is also a very limited point of view. They're translated into about 22 languages, everything from Romanian and Hungarian, and a lot of smaller countries and languages that are very difficult, I think, as well as German, Italian, French, and what always surprises me is how, because I think the stories are human stories, they find resonance all around the world, including and I like the fact that they come sometimes in languages that I mean, truly, like in Japanese and things that I can't read at all, and then you'll be sort of looking at it and it goes, whatever, it's something, or character, and then I say Jennifer, or some word, or Barbie, that they really can't find the translation for. Or sometimes they call me and they'll say, we have like some translation questions, and they say things like, when you write Oprah, do you mean opera? And I think, and that's to me is also the very American problem in some ways. And I thought it was very weird. I got one in Germany actually. What do you mean by S&M? And I was like, you started it. So.
I'm looking over a sea of faces. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for itchy head. That was not a question. Hang on, hold on. You get the microphone.
I was interested in your comment about growing up in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
I also have grown up in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Where did you grow up?
Well, Anacostia.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
And
yeah.
Later on lived on Capitol Hill.
Right, sure.
So you can get more Washington, D.C.
No, that's deep Washington, D.C. Yeah.
So I was interested because it is a very different kind of place. And just wanted to hear your views.
Right. Well, I think the thing that's interesting, so Washington, D.C., and especially when I was growing up and when you were growing up, was, and still is, a very racially divided city. It is a city where a lot of white people work in and black people live in. And it's very interesting how that divide plays itself out. And when I was a kid was when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were literally riots, that went on for 10 days. I think it's also a very strange city. I didn't know what it meant to be a nation's capital until actually I was at summer camp in the Deep South, also a very interesting place, when Richard Nixon resigned, and all of the camp counselors were sobbing and saying, "I bet Mama's having a heart attack," and things like that. And I was like, oh, wow. I just had no idea what a nation's capital meant in that way. And we had weird things, like we had neighbors who were diplomats, and they all had diplomatic immunity. So it meant actually their children could steal your bicycles and we could not get them back because the police would say, oh, no, we can't go in that driveway. It's a very, very odd place. Like no other. The closest equivalent I always think of is Los Angeles, which is kind of dominated by the film industry, and that politics is an industry. And then, curiously, I would say probably around the time of the end of the Nixon administration, it used to be when I was a little kid, that every 4 years you'd get new classmates, you'd get new neighbors. There was this incredible turnover. And then all of a sudden it became more, like I call it khaki, centrist, because everyone wanted to keep their jobs. And also the government had grown so large, there's no way to turn it over every 4 years, which also explains in part why it's very difficult for anything politically to actually change in America. Mm-hmm. It's like trying to turn an enormous, it's not even a cruise ship, it's like a planet. It's like, I can't do it. It's like, so people go into office with, I think, great intentions sometimes, and it's just very difficult.
But you make that sound like almost another country, and this seems like a different country from this one. It seems like amazingly different places.
The coasts?
Yeah.
Yeah. They are different, actually, quite different. I keep thinking at some point I want to write a novel in another country, and weirdly, if I was really doing a job in another language.
Wow. Do you speak any other languages?
Crying, I don't know if that counts. The lost language of weeping. It's a primitive language.
We have time for one more question. Stephen.
This is about May We Be Forgiven?
Sure.
Can you speak to the wrestling, the Harry at sort of the second half of the book, trying to go in the direction he didn't seem to want to go?
Right. Sure. I mean, I think so obviously it's this rather large, dense book, and I think the question was, for me, would Harry survive? Would Harry be okay? Could Harry become somebody who could manage a family? Could Harry become a parent? Could Harry grow up? And I think it was really a struggle. And the interesting thing was I didn't want it to be a struggle from an artistic and writerly point of view. It's really Harry's struggle. And so the question I sort of kept having to ask Harry, and he was not easy to talk to sometimes, was what has to happen for you? What has to change? And that's one of those big questions that we all have at different points in our life. What has to change within us so that we can live our lives differently or make different decisions? And as I think you all know, life to some degree becomes habit, and you're like, this is my habit of doing things. And how do you tease that out from this is my personality, or this is the best I can do? And you think, were I to want to try to do better, how would I do that? And how would I even know where to begin? So it was a big, very difficult thing. I mean, and both I think philosophically and artistically, and then trying to figure out how, in storytelling terms, to sort of turn that curve a little bit without being false about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you have experienced just a taste this evening of the wit and wisdom of A.M. Holmes. If the meaning of life is that you read a good book now and then, I can't recommend a better way to spend your time than these two or any of the others. A.M. will be happy to sign books for you down the back. And I'd like now for you to join with me in thanking A.M. Holmes.
Thank you very, very much.